Okay, so today I'd like to talk a little bit about the controversy and the conversation surrounding the Witch Hat Atelier anime, the UN interview with the author of the original manga, some of the UN connections with Kodansha, blah blah blah. I've been keeping up with some of the conversation around this show on Twitter/X, which is not something I would exactly recommend, but you start to see some of that obviously creeping into anime YouTube as well. And, you know, so much of the conversation from my perspective looks like a bunch of people who are really mad about the UN interview with the author, but they haven't read the interview. And then there's a bunch of people who are mad about the people who are mad about the interview, but they also haven't read the interview. So, you know, basically the usual for a debate or argument that's happening on Twitter. So you have everything ranging from, on one end, people who think that the Witch Hat Atelier anime is like literally a UN-funded industry plant meant to introduce woke themes into anime, and then all the way on the other far-flung end of the spectrum, you have people who think that anyone complaining about anything to do with any of this is completely in the wrong. It's one big nothing burger, nothing to see here, and if there is anything to see here, it's actually good. On top of the usual, if you're complaining about anything to do with this, you're a big smelly weeaboo who needs a shower, which I don't know what that has to do with anything, but obviously there is a lot of silliness on each end of this. There's just a lot of silliness in general. I mean, with the first group kind of asking questions about, where did this come from? Why is it so popular? Why is it so well animated? Why is it being marketed so heavily? And then they see the connections with the UN interview and things that, the UN has said in the past about Japanese media and all of this. And they assume that all of this is part of a conspiracy, when a lot of it is honestly really easy to explain away by just looking at demographics, the studio, the producers, and stuff like that, which I'm going to talk about. Before I ever even get into the interview, we're going to be talking about some stuff like that. But of course, it's just as silly that you see people on the other side who basically deny outright that there is anything at all to worry about in any of this. Even when it just comes down to the fact that Kodansha, the publisher of Witch Hat Atelier and one of the producers of the anime, is in fact tied to the UN, and the UN has said a lot of screwed up stuff about the anime industry and Japanese media and all of this. People on the other end who are, of course, going to basically deny that any of that is a problem. And to fling right back in the opposite direction once again, you have a lot of people who are angry about this, who think that this whole industry plant thing is a means of introducing woke elements into anime and manga. But truth be told, these sorts of things have always been a type of show and manga that you could find if you went looking for it. Obviously, there's a long tradition of yuri and yaoi and all of this kind of stuff in anime. Simultaneously, there are lots of stories in anime and manga that have traditional values and traditional conventional themes. At the same time, there's lots of stuff, well, maybe not lots of stuff, but there's a couple of shows and manga and light novels which are also kind of on the other far-flung end of the spectrum. If you want to start talking about something like the saga of Tanya the Evil, where it's, literally a Japanese businessman reincarnated as this lolly character who is dead set on making sure that Germany successfully takes over the world. Which is all to say, if you've been actually watching anime for a long time and you're not one of these tourists calling other people tourists, you know that anime and manga have always had woke series and quote-unquote fascist series, as well as, just regular traditional series and plenty of series that have nothing to do with this political or social commentary type of stuff. You've always been able to find each of these niches if you knew where to look. It's always existed. And to top it all off, I'm not going to go into a big rabbit hole about the big debate on whether or not politics should be in anime and all that. Obviously, I'm of the opinion that there's a clear difference between something like Yuru Camp and something like Psycho-Pass. One of these is clearly political, one of them is just a cute, funny show. But anyone who says that there's never been politics in anime, generally speaking, it's totally ridiculous. So, as per usual, that is all to say that there's a lot of silly arguments being made on each side of this story. So anyway, I'm going to do my best to try and address some of each of these things. I know the fact that I'm trying to play the middle ground here and just be reasonable and explain everything is probably going to get me no love from either side, but somebody's got to actually cover this properly, right? So obviously here's the interview itself. I'm going to come back to this in a bit, but just to address, like, the reason that people who are mad about this whole thing are mad doesn't just stem from the interview itself, even if a lot of people are, kind of confused about what the actual issue is here and who it's coming from. Kodansha is obviously one of the producers of this show. They do have some ties to the United Nations through this SDG Media Compact, which, as far as I can tell, is kind of like a sustainable energy, sustainable work environments, like proper, progressive work ethic type of deal. It's that kind of thing, as far as I can tell. You could read more about it if you want. It's basically a bunch of PR nonsense, as usual. But they have, as in the UN, have said a lot of really screwed up stuff about Japanese media industries, particular anime and manga, calling a lot of the media within those genres sexist and all this stuff, as well as proposing international laws or treaties which would make much of the media produced in Japan illegal, even as it concerns quote-unquote non-existent entities. Can't forget about that. And so to see this tie between Kodansha and them already is going to get people very suspicious when they've called these mediums sexist, and they've obviously called for censorship in a lot of cases. And another thing that gets people suspicious is stuff like this. The K-Manga app, which is published by Kodansha here in the US, has been experiencing a lot of severe censorship of its series. And so, although they would say this is probably to comply with the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store and all of this, a lot of people are going to see that as, being influence from the UN. So, I mean, which one's true? Who knows? Who knows, really? Either way, I would like to provide a quick counterpoint here, which I didn't really think about while recording the initial video. So, obviously, there are a lot of reasons for people to be suspicious that Kodansha is pro-censorship, given their ties with the UN and some of the K-Manga app censorship by Kodansha US. But I was also looking back over some of the shows that they've produced recently here, and while none of these are examples where they sit at the tip top of the production committees, these are all shows that they do help produce, that they are sitting on the production committee for, usually making somewhere between like the second and the third biggest contribution to each show. So starting at the top, we have a show which I believe translates to even the student council has its holes, which is a pretty obvious double meaning there. There was an OVA which released, I believe it was an OVA, leading up to the run of this actual anime, and it was very fan service heavy. I think with like band-aids covering up the naughty bits, but still very, very fan service heavy. Obviously, the Monogatari series, anyone who's watched it knows. And then there are the two, like, actually really big examples here. Yawa Yawa Sensei, which is currently airing, has full-on nudity, and Rent a Girlfriend, they just started releasing some of the Blu-rays for, I think it was this newest season, and it's, once again, explicit nudity. So while it's fine to be suspicious of Kodansha given all of the ties here, it's also important not to pretend that they're not willing to put their name as producer on explicit shows that are currently airing here in 2026, when, once again, I'm perfectly willing to admit that I think censorship of this type of content has gotten worse, even in like adult shows like Heavenly Delusion, Zom 100, which I mentioned later, 2.5 Dimensional Seductress, all shows which featured nudity in the source material, which had that content censored at the adaptation level in a way where you would actually never even really know that it was censored if you hadn't read the source material. And when the Blu-rays for those eventually came out, they were still censored. So I do think that this is a problem that has gotten worse, but there are still examples of even a company like Kodansha themselves putting their name on, investing in, and producing for series that have explicit nudity. Anyway, just a counterpoint which I thought was worth putting here for transparency's sake. But the next thing that I think is worth pointing out, this is something that Yamada Taro talked about in October 29th, 2024. This was something that was brought to their attention by a UN committee, the CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, publishing its concluding observations on the 9th Periodic Report of Japan, blah, blah, blah. Basically, the quote that he pointed out here was, animation products such as pornography, video games, and manga may promote violence against women and girls on the basis of gender or sexual orientation. Furthermore, it was recommended that existing legal measures and monitoring programs be effectively implemented to address the production and distribution of pornography, video games, and animation products that perpetuate discriminatory gender stereotypes and reinforce sexual violence against women and girls. Which is obviously basically the anime version of video games calls school shootings. It's the same crap, really. You know, as cliche as it is to say these days, it's people who can't separate fiction and reality at all, and they genuinely think that the second order effects of these things are like the real proponents of violence and discrimination and all this blah blah blah. I thought there was a very interesting response here from Kumiko Yamada of the Japanese Women's Institute of Contemporary Media Culture. She also happens to apparently be a female Japanese graphic artist, and this made it onto Forbes, and I thought it was actually a really good counterpoint that she gave, so I thought that I would read this out. She says, "The so-called sexual violence in manga and video games is a made-up thing, and as such does not threaten the rights of actual people. Therefore, it is meaningless in protecting the rights of women." Whereas the second point states that, in Japan, and especially when it comes to manga, these are creative fields that women themselves cultivated and worked hard by their own hand to create careers for themselves. If we were to ban the sale of manga that includes sexual violence, it would do the opposite and instead create a new avenue of sexism towards women. And I think the thing that she's really alluding to here, which is pretty obvious if you've ever actually looked into the types of series that are written by men and women, you would know that a lot of the series that, the UN, for example, would call sexist are written by women. That's the crazy part. When it really comes right down to it, the truth is the movements that groups like these in the UN are pushing for, they're pushing to say that there are types of stories that women shouldn't be allowed to tell. That's really what this comes down to. Even though they're saying they're fighting sexism and industry corruption, what they're really trying to say is there are certain types of stories that shouldn't be told. And a lot of those stories that they're criticizing are stories that are often being told specifically by women. So, once again, as she says, it would do the opposite and instead create a new avenue of sexism towards women. Anyway, I thought that was a really good response. Another thing, obviously this is just trying to point out like where the threads come from, why people are so suspicious of the UN, and obviously the fact that once again they have, even if it's a minor connection, a connection to Kodansha, the publisher of this manga and one of the highest ranking producers of the anime itself. And once again, as I said, I do think a lot of the criticisms that have come out against this have ran the gambit, sometimes going way too far and, really pulling on the conspiracy threads in ways that I don't think are necessarily reasonable. But, when you see people getting blocked by Kodansha for criticizing them for this sort of stuff, it's not a great look. And that's all regardless of, whatever you think about someone like Chibi, for example, or, obviously someone who's literally called permabanned.
At Give Me Ban Hammer.
I'm the Joker, baby!
But, regardless of who it is, like Kodansha just going out of their way to just block anyone, including Japanese users, just for criticizing them for what the UN has promoted in the past, for their ties to them, and now for this interview. Criticism of that type is just being met by an immediate block by them, and not a great look, whatever you might think of these creators in particular. Just not a great look to look at someone who has the pull of a couple 100,000 people and say they're being critical of us. We're just going to block them and pretend that this doesn't exist. So I would say this is basically the string which is being pulled on by the conspiracies that are occurring here. Once again, I think another component of this is the simple fact that a lot of people feel that this anime came out of nowhere. It's being promoted like crazy hard, including here by the UN.
Oh yeah. Oh boy.
It's incredibly well animated, and I think it's actually like the most popular show of this season, according to a lot of the metrics that I've looked at so far. But all of that,
What is that?
is actually very easy to explain. So as far as the actual just, explanation for the popularity of this series, I would say that there are a couple of factors at play here. I mean, one is, I think this series has actually been running since, 2016. So it's been running for about a decade, and I've seen people talking about the manga on YouTube and the like. I've seen plenty of people who really like the series up until now, and I think what's happening in this season in particular is you see that this show is really kind of filling the niche that people who are looking for the new Frieren, the new Dungeon Meshi, the new Mushoku Tensei, the new Wistoria, basically just what is this season's new, like, actual fantasy show, not like a native isekai type fantasy show, but like an actual fantasy show with interesting fantasy lore that also seems to have a decent story and good production values. So, just basically the traditional fantasy shows which have been coming back into full force recently. People are really hungry for a new one of those every season because they've been getting a bunch of really good ones. And so this season, this is the show that they're going to looking for that. And it has really good production values. It's been well marketed. It has an established manga audience that's been building for about 10 years. And people feel that the story so far is good. Another element that I think has really helped this to be incredibly popular is just the simple fact that it's kind of, in my opinion, I don't know what it says here, but I would think of this as like an E for everyone rated show. There's nothing in the show that's especially offensive or that I think would get it like crazy high ratings in any of the regions, at least that I've seen so far. So it's filling a niche that people really want to see more of. It's well produced. Story, so far, seems to be fine. And it has a long established audience from the manga. Another thing that I think is worth quickly pointing out here as well is the producers themselves. So you've got Avex Pictures, Kodansha, Twin Engine, and yes, Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll, which is always a little bit suspicious anywhere you see it, but it's at the bottom of the list, which means that they have the smallest pile in the investment. The two really important ones here are definitely going to be Avex Pictures and Kodansha. Avex Pictures is one of these like quote-unquote media conglomerates, so I guess you could think about it kind of the same way that you think about Sony Pictures, and obviously you see, One Piece, Gachiakuta, Heavenly Delusion, the final season of Fruits Basket, Zombieland Saga. We've got a bunch of big movies and big properties under the name. Got the Look Back movie right here. And these are obviously just shows that they helped produce and invest in, basically. So basically what these producers are, if you want to think about it in layman's terms, they're basically the investors in the project. And whoever invests the most is typically going to keep things like licensing rights, so they're going to get revenue over time. Probably one of these, I would guess Avex Pictures, since they're at the top, they probably have a majority investment in this, whether that be 51% or just the largest majority between the four companies. I don't know if they do like split investments, like if there's any possibility that these two both invested the same amount of money, but anyway, one of these two companies at the top is going to have licensing rights more than likely, and anything that gets licensed out that generates revenue over time, that revenue over time is mostly going to be going to them. So once again, you could think about it like the investors in a company, but in this case, it's investors in the production of an anime. And of course, in this case, like most cases, the actual studio does not sit on the production committee, which means that they don't have to invest into the production, but they, and the animators in turn, also won't be receiving any revenue over time, even if the anime that they create is incredibly successful and goes totally parabolic at the level of something like JJK or Demon Slayer or whatever. In this case, like most productions, they were most likely paid a one-time contract price up front by the producers, and that contract payment would be what is then used to pay the animators and the staff during the actual production of the anime. Anyway, I figured as long as I was on the topic, I might as well just go ahead and explain that in full. So, that's basically how to think about producers in the anime industry. The other one, obviously, being Kodansha. Kodansha is also obviously a massive publishing company. I believe they're typically vying for #1 with Shueisha, with companies like Kadokawa Corporation and Shogakukan and companies like that, trailing behind them. But these are one of the big boys. These are one of the biggest around. They've got IPs like Attack on Titan under their belt and lots of other big stuff, as you can see. Shows that they helped to produce on some level. And they also happen to be the publishers for the Witch Hat Atelier manga. So, even if these guys aren't actually at the very top of the producers list, they really have a stake in making sure that this is successful, because if this is a really successful anime that's well marketed, well produced, well animated and all this stuff, they're going to make money coming and going, if you know what I mean. They're going to make money off of the anime, and then when the anime blows up and people go running to read more of the manga and the manga's audience expands, they're going to make money there as well. Which is all to say that they really do have a vested interest to see this be a big success. So huge marketing pushes for this show, in my opinion, make a lot of sense. It's filling a niche that people are hungry for more of every single season, and it's a series that they also publish the source material for, so they have every reason imaginable to really push the marketing of this show. Now, as far as the question of, okay, but why is this thing that I've never heard of so damn well produced, so damn well animated? And I'm not going to go into individual animators here. That will be a lot of extra research work into things that I'm not really that well versed in to begin with. I'm not really a Sakuga bro. I don't know a lot of the individual animators, but I also don't think that we necessarily need to go that far to really see how obvious the explanation for this is. So the studio that's working on this show is Bug Films, and Bug Films is basically a new small studio which was founded by leadership that come from OLM. Apparently they left OLM because the work environment there was not exactly great, so they went and started their own small animation studio, Bug Films. And their first big anime that they did was Zom 100. Fittingly, a show about a dude who, starts out working in a really bad working environment in a Burako Kikyo, the black company. And so, if you didn't watch Zom 100, basically the lowdown on the animation quality for this was that it started out absolutely banging. The first 3 episodes, as well as the first half of the show to a degree, were really quite amazing, especially coming from a new small animation studio that, didn't necessarily have all of the connections to pull in a bunch of big names. The 2 issues that are worth pointing out, one I want to point out because I'm sure I'm going to get shit if I don't bring it up when we're talking about the UN censorship and all that stuff. Zom 100 as an adaptation, 100% censored, at least compared to the manga itself. Now, I'm not talking about the colorful painted blood of the zombies. That was just a freaking awesome direction choice. That was a way of saying, hey, I think his name is Akira, if I remember correctly. Akira is way into this new zombie apocalypse. It looks so much more rosy and colorful than the job that he no longer has to go to. That visual metaphor was beautiful. But as far as the sexual content that came from the manga, pretty much all of it except for the dude showing his butt, everything else is either totally censored at the source in a way that you know it's never going to be censored. If you get the Blu-ray, it's still going to be censored in that way that things are reframed and covered up creatively in the way that scenes are framed. But, a lot of these scenes, they're either fully censored or they were basically toned down. There are a lot of fan service cuts in the manga that aren't explicit, which they really held back on for the anime. Anyway, the other thing which is a little more important to bring up is that the show did experience a delay towards the end of its production. I think the last 3 episodes were delayed until like a couple of months later. And, if it's not obvious enough, it never came back quite as amazing looking as those first couple of episodes, but it was a solid ending. And all in all, ignoring the fact that it was, as an adaptation, censored in a sense, whether that was the director's decision, whether that was producers, whether that was, a way of them trying to get through some sort of region blocks if they wanted to get the show into China. So, they just made the censored version, never went back and uncensored it. Who knows why they did it, but ignoring that and ignoring the fact that, there were like clear delays in the production, obviously a plagued production in some sense, the season is still, all in all, quite solid, with really good animation for its best scenes. And so then you have to ask the question, well, it's a small studio, it's their first new project. What happens when they don't work on anything else for 2 to 3 years? Because the only other thing that they have to their credit right now is a movie, which we don't know what it is, and it's not coming out until 2027, date to be announced. So what happens then when they have 2 to 3 years to do a legitimate pre-production phase for a show that is likely to be a success and is being produced and funded by companies who have a real stake and a real investment in seeing this be successful? Well, you get a really damn well animated show, as we've seen over the first, I think, 4 weeks now. So to also talk a bit about the director, and to a lesser degree, the assistant director, the director is this dude, Ayumu Watanabe. He was chief director for Komi-san. He was the director of Summertime Rendering. He's obviously directing Witch Hat Atelier right now. He directed, I think this one was After the Rain. He directed Children of the Sea, which is an absolutely beautiful movie, by the way. He directed Mysterious Girlfriend X, and a couple of other things that he worked on here, like Space Brothers. One thing that kind of blows my mind, apparently he's also directing Akane Banashi, which is another beautiful show that's airing right now. This really makes me wonder, once again, if maybe they did like a long pre-production for Witch Hat Atelier, and like maybe it's mostly finished already, because I cannot imagine, as good as both of these shows look, running director roles for both of them at the same time. Once again, though, there's also the assistant director. This dude also directed and storyboarded episode 3 of Zom 100, which is one of the better looking episodes, absolutely. He did episode direction for Summertime Rendering, so once again, just to point out that they have worked together before. Episode director for the final episode of Heavenly Delusion, and I mean, you can see the credits. It's not like crazy experience the way that the primary director is. I don't think that he's been like a head director for any show. I don't see anything here. But experienced director and an assistant director who worked on the studio's last anime and has worked with the director before. And to top it all off, a soundtrack by Kevin Pinkin, the same dude who worked on the soundtracks for Shield Hero, Made in Abyss, The Apothecary Diaries, and the Spice and Wolf remake. You couldn't ask for a better composer than that, right? I mean, Kevin Pinkin or Evan Call, right? I mean, those are the two obvious choices for a show like this. Anyway, just thought that was worth pointing out since I forgot about it initially. So, anyway, that is all to say that I don't think it's some big shock that the show is popular, the show is well animated, the show is well marketed. It's well animated because it's been left in the oven to cook long enough by a studio that has proven that it can do good work. It's being produced, not primarily, but secondarily at least, by someone who really has an outsized investment in having this be successful, because they're going to make money off the anime and they're going to make money off of the manga. So all to say, once again, those elements, you know, the questions about where did this come from, why is it so popular, why is it so well animated, blah, 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 all of this very easily explained. Still, plenty of reason to be mad about the things that the UN has said over the years. Plenty of reason, you know, to be suspicious of the fact that Kodansha is just straight up blocking people, including people in the Japanese audience. The connections and all that. The censorship, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that brings us to the actual interview. I think I've pretty much talked about everything else except for this. And, you know, as I go through this, I would just like people to keep in mind, you know, separate the interviewer and the interviewee, aka the author, Kamome Shirahama. And I think if you pay attention to the way that she words her responses, you'll be surprised at how much of this I think is really just her trying to be cordial and polite. She's not trying to start an argument with the interviewer, obviously. And, you know, if you read it a different way than that, totally understandable, but let's at least go through the interview. And, you know, sorry for even, like, coding your expectations for it in that way. I should probably just let people read it the way that they see it. So the first thing that we have is a quick quote by Kamome Shirahama, the manga author, which says, "My stories can speak to readers who feel uncertain about themselves." So obviously whoever did the interview and posted this up, that's the headline quote that they wanted to establish things with. The interviewer then goes on to say, to introduce the interview, "The creator behind the famous manga series Witch Hat Atelier, Japanese manga artist Kamome Shirahama, has gained global fame thanks to her unique style. Recognized for its elaborate drapery and meticulous settings, it evokes medieval illuminated manuscripts, Studio Ghibli films, or the world of Harry Potter. While asserting her taste for American comics, she remains deeply rooted in the manga tradition, a form of expression at the crossroads of art and entertainment, where women now play a prominent role." So obviously we're off to a great start. The first question from the interviewer is, "How does one become a mangaka?" She responds, "I did not really plan to become a manga artist at first. I studied design in school, and after graduating, I was working as a freelance illustrator. Then, while I was active in that field, a manga editor approached me at an event called Kamitia, a Japanese fair for original self-published manga and illustration. That encounter became the turning point for me. It was the moment when I began to think that perhaps I could try drawing manga as well." I'm not really going to interrupt anywhere in here where I don't think it's necessary. The biggest thing, obviously, I'm going to talk about is this question down here. I will comment on that. But anyway, the next question from the interview is, "In your view, what defines an excellent manga artist?" She responds, "That is a difficult question because it is such a broad one. From a professional standpoint, an important quality is the ability to meet deadlines, but also to create work that offers a fresh perspective. At the same time, on a more personal level, every artist is trying to express something different. Not everyone wants to draw the same things or explore the same themes. For that reason, I think the ideal image of what a manga artist should be can vary greatly from one person to another." Which is a totally fair answer, and, you know, it kind of actually highlights what I was talking about earlier, which is that there are manga and anime that come from all sorts of different far-flung points in the perspective. As much as people like to talk about how manga and anime is this, or it is this, the truth is the variety, and the variety coming from sincere authors, is a big part of the appeal. And, you know, just to quickly compare that to sort of the same thing that occurs in, like, Hollywood, for example, and the AAA video games industry, there's a big difference, in my opinion, in an author who has their own, you know, political or social ideas that they're trying to weave into their story. There's a much greater level of sincerity and personal ability that comes from an individual author or artist, or an individual author who has like one editor or a small team of editors when compared to what we so often get in America, which is really designed by committee. It's hundreds or even thousands of people working on a single story, trying to design it to be a certain thing. And that's why, in my opinion, so much of the same things that we let people get away with in anime and manga, we let them get away with because it just comes off totally differently. It feels so forced in so much of the Hollywood slop and propaganda from both sides, because there's absolutely plenty of it coming from both sides. You know, whether that's the woke propaganda, which we've absolutely seen a lot of over the previous decade or so, or whether it's, you know, just like pro-government propaganda, or, you know, the endless number of movies and shows about corporate America and this type of thing. That is so far disconnected to me when compared to a manga or an anime written by like one person or a couple of people who are really just being sincere and personable in their actual beliefs, and not just what they're trying to design by committee, the way that so much of the Hollywood productions that people would often compare these to, Hollywood and the AAA video game industry. Anyway, hopefully that makes sense. I think it's clearly a reason why, like, the appeal of manga and anime, even when it comes to shows that kind of diverge from people's primary belief systems, still don't come off so much as propaganda. And it's because oftentimes they're written by one single person who really believes what they're writing, instead of what you get out of... I'm repeating myself, you get the point. Anyway, it's just talking about the variety, as she says. For that reason, I think the ideal image of what a manga artist should be can vary greatly from one person to another. And obviously the part that they highlight here is one essential quality of a mangaka is the ability to create work that offers a fresh perspective, which once again feels a lot different reading it when you know that it's the thing that the UN interviewer wanted to highlight, but feels quite natural when it's coming from the individual. Anyway, to continue, the next question that they ask: how do you see manga as a form of artistic expression? The author answers, I think manga is very much art. At the same time, it also occupies a kind of middle ground between a drawing and a novel, because it conveys stories through pictures. But manga is also entertainment, and it is also a product. For me, that is part of what makes it so interesting. It is something mixed. It cannot be reduced to a single category, which is, in my opinion, a reasonable and fairly grounded answer to simply acknowledge the fact that manga and anime, by extension, are entertainment, are art, but they are also a product. Totally reasonable answer. And this is the big one. The big kahuna. The interviewer, the UN interviewer, not the author, asks the question, like yourself, more and more women have managed to make their mark in this traditionally male-dominated field. How do you explain this shift? Now, this is where it's worth really strongly pointing out that the interviewer at the UN, the person who almost certainly knows absolutely next to nothing about anime or manga, does not really propose this as a question. They don't ask, has the number of female mangakas changed? They state it as a fact. So here's the thing. It's worth pointing out that there are absolutely 100% tons of my favorite stories coming out today that originate from female authors, whether they come from manga or light novels. Just a couple of the ones that come off the top of my head. Obviously, here's Witch Hat Atelier, currently airing. There's also Gachiakata, that comes from a female author, Kei Urana. There's Bocchi the Rock. There's My Dress Up Darling. There's Shangri-La Frontier. There's The Apothecary Diaries. There's Dungeon Meshi. Honestly, the list goes on and on. There are tons of mangaka that are authoring the stories for many of our favorite anime today. That's 100% true. The thing is, there have always been female mangaka and authors and artists who were prolific and prominent in the manga industry. I believe there have been female manga authors like at the at the least since like the 1950s. Okay, so yeah, I went and looked this up, and Machiko Hasegawa actually started writing the comic strip for Saze-san in 1946. Saze-san went on to be adapted as an anime, and it actually holds the record for the world's longest running animated television series with over 7,000 episodes, and it's ongoing. So yeah, we owe the longest running animated Japanese series to a woman born in 1920. Booyah, baby. But, you know, just to talk about a couple of the more prominent examples, when you think of like the Battle Shonen series, which is basically the most heralded as like a true masterpiece, always makes the top lists. Also, one of the only ones I can think of that got 2 anime adaptations, Full Metal Alchemist. Full Metal Alchemist was written by a female author. There's also Inuyasha. There's also Ranma 1/2, Urusei Yatsura, Sailor Moon, Cardcaptor Sakura, freaking Nana. And just like, speaking of Nana, think about shoujo works for a minute. Shoujo manga have been around forever. And they're primarily written by women. Always have been. So, you know, once again, this is the UN interviewer really going out of their way to state this as fact, not ask about it so much. They're stating it as fact. And they almost certainly don't know anything about the industry or its history. They also, and maybe this is going on a bit of a tangent too early, I'm going to get to the answer in a minute, but the UN obviously has to find themselves in a really quite the pickle, quite the predicament, because they have went out of their way to say that manga and anime are sexist industries. They've went out of their way to say that the sexual content within them is sexist. They've went out of their way to say that this is a traditionally male-dominated field. But the truth is, these industries, at least at the level of the authors and the artists themselves, they're way ahead of the UN. These have always been fields which have had tons of female authors in them, and often cases the female authors are specifically the ones writing the stories that the people at the UN would call sexist, would want censored. And it's quite the pickle. Like, how do you have a cogent argument for anything when it's on that level? But, you know, once again, it's one of the reasons why they have to really state this as fact and not ask about it more straightforwardly. Anyway, that's quite the tangent, but just going into the answer itself, I would say keep in mind that she's being told that this is the way that it is by the person who's interviewing them. And given Japanese cultural standards, you're being interviewed by a business, you're a representative of the people above you. I mean, I don't know if she knows that they have ties directly to Kodansha, almost certainly does. Probably not trying to start an argument here. So just pay attention to the way that things are worded here, and we'll see if you agree with my perspective on this. So she says, Japanese manga artists work in a somewhat special environment. Many creators do not use their real names, and I think that has made it possible for many women to be very active. A certain degree of anonymity can make it easier to express one's feelings openly, including deeper emotions or cries from the heart. That may be one reason why there are so many women manga artists today, and why it feels as though their numbers continue to grow. In terms of the newer generation, I no longer feel like a newcomer, but rather like someone in mid-career. Looking at recent works, I often sense anger, indignation, and very strong assertions within them. We are living in an unstable world, and many creators seem to be trying to find a place where they can stand. I feel that more and more works are carrying that kind of emotion. So it's worth pointing out before I say all of what I'm about to say, obviously, we don't know who translated this, if the actual interview was just conducted in English or if there's, you know, language barrier stuff. But if this was translated, being that it's own UNESCO, it's own the UN website, I would be willing to bet that it was probably translated by some of their people. And yet, at least from my perspective, when I read through this, I think that has made it possible for many women to be very active. Has made it possible for women to be very active. That doesn't necessarily say it is now possible. It says it has been possible. She talks about the degree of anonymity, allowing stories to be told and feelings to be expressed that might not be able to otherwise. And that's true for female authors and male authors, in my opinion. I see a lot of the authors of Big Battle Shonen and the like, rom-coms, all sorts of series, remain anonymous. You can't blame them for it. But she also goes on to say, once again, that may be one reason why there are so many manga artists today and why it feels as their numbers continue to grow. She also points out that she no longer feels like a newcomer, which totally makes sense. She's been writing this series in particular for over a decade now. And big shock, that entire decade she has in fact been a woman. So she was a woman writing in this industry for a decade now. And, maybe I'm nitpicking the actual language, but that is all to say, when I read through this, I read someone who is not necessarily saying, yes, I agree with the thing that you said here. It's more saying, okay, I'm not going to start an argument about this. There's no reason to. I'm just going to riff on why, generally speaking, this is in fact an industry where female authors have been able to flourish and why I think that that is. But anyway, once again, maybe that's like reverse nitpicking, but when I read a line like, why it feels as though their number continue to grow, I get the feeling that they're trying to be polite, trying not to disagree, but also trying not to necessarily full-on agree with something that they probably know isn't as true as the UN interviewer is making it out to be. But, that's just my take. I guess I'll read through the rest of this, just in case people are actually interested. I don't think it's too much longer. Yeah, this is fine. I'll read through it, and if there's anything else I feel like I have to contribute, I'll interject. Otherwise, the interviewer then asks the question, your work, Witch Hat Atelier, has achieved international success. How would you introduce it to someone unfamiliar with it? The author responds, it is a story, the first volume of which was released in 2016 in Japan, set in a world where people believe that only those born with magical power can use magic. The protagonist is an ordinary girl who does not possess magic, but who longs to become a magic user. Through a certain incident, she encounters a magic user, enters the world of magic, and gradually begins to uncover its secrets. This is a story about possibility. Even a child without special inborn abilities can become a magic user. That framework is central to the story, but so is the emotional idea behind it. The possibility that someone who seems ordinary, or who feels excluded from a world of talent, may still find a way into it. That is one of the reasons I hope the story can speak to readers who feel uncertain about themselves. And personally, I think a lot of this is obviously just, here's what the story is basically about. This part itself, I would say, is not something that I would go out of my way to call woke. This is really just her saying, part of a component of my story is that becoming skilled at something is not about talent necessarily. It's about working hard to become skilled at something, which I really think of as more of a traditional value than anything that I would call woke. But anyway, the interviewer goes on. The series has won several international awards, including the prestigious Eisner Award in the Best U.S. Edition of International Materials, Asia category in 2020. What do you think explains its global success? For me, that success was completely unexpected, or rather it was a very pleasant surprise. I was genuinely shocked to be selected for such an award. Initially, I didn't truly expect the work to be recognized so widely, beyond Japan's borders. But since I work on American comics projects, I had overseas readers and manga fans in mind from the very beginning as part of the audience. That may have helped shape the way I thought about the work and its potential reach. And so obviously, I think this is another part of what makes some people suspicious of this story, generally speaking. Not just the fact that they've heard about, some of the more like progressive themes, representation and all that comes later on in the story. I mean, the closest thing I've seen to any of that in the anime so far, 4 episodes in, is like the existence of a black woman. But I mean, I'm told that there's way more representation and way more progressive themes later on in the manga. So alongside that, the fact that she also works on American comic projects and has kept in mind the idea of this as something that could have the reach of a global audience. She's kept that in mind from the very beginning. This is another thing that I'm sure pushes on people to be, suspicious of the work, and obviously suspicious of the industry trend in and of itself. And I don't blame anyone for being suspicious of that, but I also think that if the story is good and sincere, I don't have a problem with any of that, to be honest. I advocate a lot for like anti-censorship and all this sort of stuff, but I also think there's certainly a place for a story like this, which I would think of as kind of, once again, like an E for everyone type of story. And, part of the reason I've been thinking about that more recently, as I've been slowly reading through Hayao Miyazaki's Starting Point, where, it's basically a collection of interviews, essays, magazine articles, blah, blah, blah. But he talks about, the thirst for works that can be viewed by anyone, whether they be an adult or a child alike. The, need for things that anyone can consume in the anime industry, and his perceived lack thereof. Obviously this was decades ago that he was talking about this, but he talks about the need for shows and movies that appeal in that way and also are crafted to be incredibly well produced series that appeal to a wide demographic, a wide age demographic as well, and obviously that have the production values that will allow them to be taken seriously. And personally, there's a part of me that would argue that there's just as much a need for niche works that are willing to be humble in their production, because I think those are a massive part of the appeal of anime. And yes, those include more controversial and more explicit series. But it's true, there is a need for the opposite to exist as well. And once again, as far as, just to speak about variety, the fact that both can exist within this one medium, these two mediums, manga and anime, is a big part of the appeal. So, just to, riff on that, kind of give the devil its due, and try to make the opposite argument reasonably enough as well. The interviewer continues, "Indeed, you also work on overseas studio projects. What is the difference between that and creating manga?" She says, "That is a completely different experience from creating manga. For me, collaborating with other people to create a work and immersing myself in manga creation on my own are two entirely different processes. The nature of the work is different, and the role I am expected to play is different as well. So the main distinction is not really between Japan and overseas, but rather between collaborative production and individual creation. Working as part of a team entails a different relationship to the project from working alone, whereas the process is far more inward and self-contained." And once again, this is kind of relevant to what I was talking about earlier, being that, she talks about the fact that working on Western or overseas projects, which are more collaborative, is one where, arguably you take a bit of a backseat and a lot of people are playing support roles in doing teamwork for the actual creation of a series or property. She points out that, working alone on manga and anime is a process far more inward and self-contained. I would once again point out that this is a massive part of the appeal. It's the fact that, these are stories that are written by individuals, and I would argue that they come off as being more sincere and more personable for that very reason. Not to knock her for, working on collaborative projects, but just my perspective. Anyway, the interviewer's next question is, do you think manga has become a universal language? That's quite the question. The author answers, when I attend events outside Japan, whether in Europe, Asia, or the United States, I see many people drawing manga. One reason may be that it is such an accessible medium. You can begin with only a desk, a pen, and paper. That simplicity makes it easy for many people to enter. And the UN quote here, the accessibility of manga as a medium has contributed to its vast global spread. And I would just quickly point out that, I mean, as someone who obviously lives in the United States and lives in a very southern area in a small town, I also see people, like especially younger people, drawing manga, the ones that don't have their phone out, buried in that. I'll often see drawing manga and anime style art sometimes. It's something I see more than anything when I go to church, funny enough. She continues, also, even if someone does not understand the language, the pictures and the stories are often still understandable and readable. I think that is one of the medium's great strengths. Because of that appeal, I feel that manga is spreading very widely across the world. And obviously that's just the appeal of a visual medium. Simple enough. The interviewer goes on to ask, your drawing style is often praised as both universal and rooted in manga traditions. How do you approach that balance? She answers, what I draw is fundamentally a Western-style fantasy world. In order to express that world as fully as possible, I felt that woodblock prints or classical artistic styles might be effective. I wanted to convey the atmosphere of that era and that worldview through the style itself. At the same time, many artists choose their tools and visual languages according to the worlds that they want to depict. Some create Japanese-style works with brushes, while others use digital tools or computer graphics for cyber or science fiction settings. In that sense, style and technique are part of how a creator expresses the world of the work. I see myself as one example of that broader approach. And that's interesting enough, the type of story that you're writing, the type of world that you're trying to create and build out, obviously can influence the types of artistic mediums that you would want to apply to them. Not a whole lot to say there. I'm probably just repeating what she said, basically. And the final question she asks, what projects are you currently working on? The interviewer asks. And the author responds, currently I'm working on illustrations for the popular mobile social game Fate Grand Order. I'm also creating novel illustrations for an upcoming work by the Japanese fantasy author Nahoko Ue. Oh boy, this is a doozy. The Japanese fantasy author Nahoko Uehashi, as well as artwork for Pokemon game cards. There are also a few other projects that I cannot yet speak about, but I can't wait for them to be announced. And so yeah, I mean, that's the end of the interview itself. I would argue, basically the same thing I said at the beginning. To me, this really comes off as the interviewer obviously has their agenda and the way that they want to frame things. The interviewee, the author of Witch Hat Atelier, is definitely not going out of their way to argue against anything that they say, but I also don't see anywhere where the author is in this interview like saying something that's totally out of left field, that's agreeing, like hardline agreeing with the worst parts of the agenda that the UN has here. A lot of people will be mad, and I totally understand that. A lot of people will be mad just at the fact that this interview even occurred. And I get it, but when I actually went and read this interview, I thought the interview itself is, outside of what the interviewer says, mostly a nothing burger. It's still understandable that people are angry, because this was probably an interview which was set up by Kodansha. Kodansha does have their ties to the United Nations, and all the things that the United Nations has said in the past about the sexism within anime and manga, how they view the explicit content as something which needs to be censored, needs to be removed, even though many of the people authoring those works happen to be female, and although they would like to paint the picture that most of the authors being female is a new thing and is part of the trend that they've helped to push, the reality is the industry has always had tons of prolific female authors and has always had tons of the kinds of themes that they want to push in a very unnatural way. The things that they want to push in a very unnatural way have occurred within anime and manga naturally. And because it's occurred more naturally, it's better for it. As far as the actual show, Witch Hat Atelier, yeah, baby! Well, once again, I mean, I've only seen 4 episodes of the anime. I haven't seen anything that strikes me as particularly propagandistic or, you know, like intrusive politics, as they often say. Maybe it's gonna get like way worse as the story goes on. It's entirely possible. I hear a lot of people claiming that eventually the female characters just start, you know, giving like feminist talking points as their dialogue.
Doubt. Be skeptical. Hard to believe.
I have no idea if any of that's true. I'm not gonna pretend that I do. I haven't looked at much of the manga beyond the first chapter or 2. And obviously what I've seen other people say about it in, you know, YouTube analysis and breakdowns. But, I mean, hopefully here I have explained everything that one could need to know about what this situation really is and why so many of the arguments being made on both sides of this are totally silly. It's totally natural to be mad at the UN. It's totally natural to be mad at Kodansha for partnering with them, for the fact that they've been banning people for criticizing them for these things. But honestly, I feel like to be mad at the author themselves just for taking part in any of this seems really silly to me. Personally, I'm quite enjoying the show so far. It's well animated, obviously. It has, you know, a nice cozy vibe. Like I said earlier, like the fact that it's kind of filling the niche of shows like Frieren, Mushoku Tensei, Dungeon Meshi, Wistoria. I mean, I too appreciate having a new show of that type coming out, and it's really well produced. And it's totally understandable that, as you know, even beyond just my personal enjoyment, I look at that and see how well produced it is and how very much it is designed to be a work that you could watch alone or with the whole family, with basically anyone. Really gives it a huge selling point that is fairly unique to it, and it's perfectly natural that it's very popular. It's perfectly natural that the publisher and producer Kodansha is pushing for it to be heavily marketed because they stand to make money going in both directions. And while I do 100% think that the people at the UN here have their agenda that they want to push through that story and through stories like it, you know, in their desire to make the anime and manga industries what they want them to be, I can't put that on the author themselves. That seems so ridiculous to me, especially as someone who knows that stories like this have existed in manga and anime for ages. I mean, once again, to bring it back to Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, like, everyone loves those movies, but like if you go back and think about it,
that's it. That's all I want. Just think about it.
They're very much like environmental stories, and they come from an author who has been, you know, on the ground, you know, trying to make a difference in the real world. So, like, I wouldn't criticize Hayao Miyazaki for it. I'm not gonna criticize her for it either, unless the story completely falls apart later, at which point I will say the thing that is natural to say, which is badly written story bad. Other than that, other than the possibility of the story actually being poorly written later, like the idea that it has politics or social ideas or representation that I might not wholeheartedly agree with. It's a totally ridiculous reason to, hate a series that was written by a single author. If it's well written and it's not pushy, it's not propagandistic, it's not intrusive, as long as the politics and the social ideas and the representation, as long as that doesn't ruin the story and the inherent appeal of the series, I think that I will continue to enjoy it, just as I continue, to enjoy plenty of shows that don't have any of that stuff in them, and just as I continue to enjoy plenty of shows that are all the way over on the far-flung area of, politics in anime. Anyway, I've rambled about this for nearly an hour and a half. I'm gonna chop this up. If I forgot anything, I'll go back and try to throw it in there. Obviously, as always, I could be totally wrong about, any individual point in here. I could be missing something that's important. Maybe there's something that I didn't address. You're free to drop a question or clarification of this or that down below. I welcome any criticism of my perspective on this, but I just wanted to provide a nice, fully explored, reasonable perspective on a story that I think a lot of people are getting a little bit crazy about. The reality is, this is, it's a pretty good new E for everyone fantasy show. It's popular. Most people watching it like it, and it will continue to be the case. And, one of the biggest things to remember is, like, when you go totally crazy trying to paint something that is mostly a non-issue as, like, a big, vast conspiracy theory, when you start talking about boycotting a series that most people, I promise you, most people looking at this series are enjoying it, and you're talking about boycotting it because you think it's an industry plant. You make all of the efforts to fight back against censorship and obviously, like, the UN themselves narrative. You make all of these things harder to argue for when you are a hammer and everything is a nail, when you just have to have the most controversial take on this. You have to have that rage bait video about this. And, once again, just like seeing people go after the author herself because of this, it's totally ridiculous.
全然今日の議題とは違うんですけど、何作っても海外に出して何が燃えてもうちのコンテンツのことは守り抜くっていう姿勢を見せることかなって思っていて、外に出す時にはカルチャライズとか翻訳とかいろいろやるけど、その人たちが海外で日本のそこに合わせたものを見て、日本の面白いやんけって日本の見に来たら、なんだこれはけしからんみたいな、そういうこの海外が知ってしまったことによって攻撃を受けた時に、やかましいこれが日本じゃっていうのを国として毅然とした対応をするから、もう好きにやってっていう、その腹のくくりっていうのは必要なのかなと思ってます。